Hi guys, it's Reagan and welcome back to another video. Today's video I'm so excited about because I'm going to be chatting about two of my favorite genre combinations, and that is fantasy and romance. That's right, today I'm going to be recommending some fantastic fantasy reads that have a great romantic element to it as well. Just like the last time I filmed this video, the recommendations today really kind of run the gamut of options. Some of them are really romance forward, while others have a fantastic fantasy plot with a wonderful secondary plotline of romance too, which is still really important to the story overall. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into the recommendations. The first book I have to recommend is Daughter of the Forest by Juliet Marillier. This book truly has it all, and that does include a really romantic plotline as well. This book is absolutely gripping from page one. It's emotional, and we're following our main character on a very perilous journey. Specifically, this book is set in the Seven Waters Kingdom, and Juliet Marillier's writing style is incredibly atmospheric and very, very nature focused. In a lot of ways, this fantasy book really reminds me of like cottagecore fantasy, if that was a genre type. And in the story, we follow our main character, Sorsa, and she is the youngest child to the Seven Waters clan, and she has 7 older brothers, and she's incredibly close to all of them. After the passing of her mother, Sorsa herself has always been able to kind of run wild. She has complete access to the entire keep, as well as she spends most of her times outdoors. She can also read, and she's very, very good at the healing arts. At the beginning of the story, though, everything sort of changes when her father remarries, and her new stepmother actually casts an evil spell on all of her brothers and her father. In hopes of saving everyone she loves, we follow Sorsa as she sets out on an impossible quest and journey, having to traverse even so far to the shores of her enemy, all while having to complete impossible tasks while not uttering a single word. This is a story following Sorsa's journey, and a part of that journey is a romantic plotline. The writing style of this book is absolutely dreaming, but again, this is actually a rather darker story. There are a few trigger warnings in this book, but it's also just absolutely astounding. You will be sucked in by this tale. I love Sorsa as a main character, and there's also other books in this series as well, following another member of this family, and all of those books also have romantic plot lines, but it's really about young women kind of coming into their own power and using like the power of their love and devotion to try to save everyone they know around them. It's seeped with magic and atmosphere. It's so good, and I guarantee you will not be able to put this book down, and it also has a fantastic romantic element too. The next book I have to recommend is a fantasy romance series that is very central on the romantic plotline, and it's absolutely so adorable, and that is the Regency Fairy Tale series by Olivia Atwater, with the first one being Half a Soul. This is exactly as it's described to be. It is a Regency romance book with fairy tale and fae elements to it. This is also a series with each book kind of following a new protagonist, their sort of main love interest storyline, but you kind of see all the characters interact within the same universe, and you often see crossovers book over book, a very standard and lovable structure that you often find in romance series. Overall, I also would say the spice level of this series is definitely on the lower side. This is definitely more leaning into the adorable butterfly feeling of like falling in love. It also has those elements of propriety that you find in this style of romance series as well. And in book 1, we're introduced to our main character, Dora, and Dora has no sense of embarrassment or like shame, and she kind of struggles sometimes through social situations because she can't really understand all of the social cues. This is actually a condition as a result of being cursed by a fairy when she is a child, and half her soul is missing. This, of course, is a secret within her family, and her family is also still pretty interested in trying to secure her the best match possible, especially going into the new London season. Dora herself, though, just kind of wants to be a wallflower, disappear in the background, and support her favorite cousin, who's an astonishing beauty with a fantastic personality and also her best friend. Of course, though, her season is turned utterly upside down when she runs into Elias Wilder, the ill-mannered Lord Sorcerer of London, and he kind of draws her into fairy affairs. This book is just absolutely delightful. It has, of course, all the trappings of a Regency romance, the lingering stares, the soft and quiet touches, the balls and parties, the little walks, all the decorum that kind of has to take place in this style of story. But alongside that, you also have a really intriguing fantasy plotline fueled by fae magic and the fae realm as well, adding a really new fresh take to a beloved romance setup that I personally really enjoy. Obviously, the Lord Sorcerer has that grumpy trope about him, which he clearly uses for defense fence to prevent anyone from really seeing or loving who he truly is. Because Dora herself isn't really bothered by traditional social cues, she completely ignores and sees past all of his attempts of being rude, and that dynamic is absolutely hilarious throughout this entire story. I loved book 1 in this series, and the rest of the books are just as delightful as well. If you're looking for a cozy and cute romance series, this is a perfect one to check out. The next book I have to recommend is definitely a fantasy read that has more of a secondary romance plotline, but I will say the relationships and the romantic dynamic that's present within this series is very, very emotional and really important to the plot, which is why I'm including it within this recommendation video. That series is the Foundry Side series by Robert Jackson Bennett. This is a trilogy that just recently wrapped up. I also read book 3 and really enjoyed it. So I can confirm that the entire arc of this fantasy world is worth checking out and does end in a satisfying way. And it's also just like beautiful and engrossing, and again, the character connections that are present in this, including a romance, will just melt your heart, break your heart, make you want to cry, if you know what I mean. The series follows a rather large cast of characters, but in book 1 we're introduced to our main character, which is Sansia. And Sansia is a thief, and a rather good one at that. And she lives in Foundry Side. In her world and in her city, about 80% of the land is controlled by very powerful merchant houses, and it's not just like an economy, they actually have enclosed mini cities within the city itself, and the rest of the land, about 20%, is called Foundry Side, and it's left completely lawless. Sansia at the beginning of book 1 is hired to steal an impossible artifact, which she successfully does because she's very good at her job, but this kind of throws her in the middle of merchant house politics, and conflict really begins to escalate from there. This fantasy series truly has it all. The plot is incredible. It is so fast-paced. Structurally, I would say each book is kind of like a new and different style of heist, following a group of underdogs trying to take on a much larger and more powerful force than them, which is always a really entertaining setup to read. On top of that, the magic system in this world is fascinating. I always describe it as kind of like magical coding. Basically, if you know the language of a raw material or an item, break in and rewrite it to have it act differently. But what really brings this entire series together outside of the explosive plot and really cool magic system are the characters. You fall in love with everyone, and those character dynamics, platonic and romantic, is why you are so invested in this plot and story, and why you won't be able to put these books down at all. I love the development of the romance in this series. I thought it was beautiful. I was absolutely in love with both of them and the love that they had for each other. And again, it's actually really important to the plot itself as these characters are making decisions and working within the universe that is this fantasy series. This book is so good. This series is so good. It will break you, it will reshape you, and it's also just like very creative and unique within the fantasy space. So if you're looking for something that has obviously a lot of plot, a lot of magic, a very intense world building sort of epic fantasy trilogy, but also has a really well written secondary plotline of romance, this is a fantastic series to check out. Next up, I have 2 really fantastic urban fantasy series recommendations. Both of these series, while different, have the same trappings of like a great slow burn romance that is very central to the plotline overall, but really intriguing world building, a interesting and very large cast of characters to fall in love with. Both of them are pretty long. This classic urban fantasy romance sort of centered series that are great checkouts if you haven't read them. The first series I'm talking about is the Mercy Thompson series by Patricia Briggs. This is a very long, very beloved series, which also has a lot of offshoots that I'm personally in the midst of and can't wait to read more. The first book is called Moon Called, and we're introduced to our main character, Mercy. And Mercy is a mechanic, and she's also a shapeshifter. She's able to transform into a coyote. Mercy is surrounded by supernatural creatures, and in her world, supernatural creatures exist, and the public, the general public, knows about them. She is friends with a werewolf, she is friends with a vampire, and she also works with other types of fae creatures. Generally speaking, Mercy likes to keep her head down. She's really just trying to do her job, live in her small town, which is in Washington State, and just kind of like live her life. But when werewolf politics begin to really get out of control, she's sort of drawn into a larger mystery. I really liked book 1 of the Mercy Thompson series. Mercy as a main character roots the story so well. She's very likable, and the fun thing about these like longer urban fantasy fantasy series, they really do a great job with pacing. There's so much angst, there's so much anticipation with the romance, but also with development of things like magic and powers and the plot line itself. I love like a slower paced urban fantasy series. I find them addicting and I'm not able to put them down. Again, the first book of this really hooked me and does centrally kind of involve werewolves, so it's a really interesting one to check out. Next up, I also have to recommend the Hidden Legacy series by Alana Andrews. The first one is Burn For Me, a very classic cover in this genre space, but this is another one that really hooked me from book one. And in this series, we follow our main character, Nevada, and she is a detective. That's her job. She helps run her family's like investigative company, and Nevada is really good at her job, and that's because she has a set of magical abilities that lets her tell if someone's lying. So she's basically like a walking lie detector test. In the world that she lives in, magic is real, and there's different types of elemental magic that exist, and there's also different classifications, with a prime being the most powerful, but most people with magic have kind of a lower end of the spectrum ability. In her fantasy world as well, there are these really rich and powerful families that basically try to cultivate having as many primes as possible, and at the beginning of this book, she and her family's like firm is hired to locate and track down a prime from one of these really rich and powerful families. She doesn't want to take this job. She normally takes lower stakes jobs. They're basically forcing her hand and threatening her family's livelihood, so she has to go out and try to convince this sort of man who's playing anarchist to return to his family. In the midst of her investigation, she runs into another very powerful figure and powerful prime from a different family named Mad Rogan. Yes, I realize that is probably one of the worst names you've ever heard. It's true. I get it. They hate each other, but they're trying to also work with each other to locate this individual. Obviously, a will they won't they begins to form, and the start of the series sort of kicks off from there. I really, again, liked this book. I think the setup of a detective agency is great, again, for a longer series. It really provides an opportunity for the mystery of the week. There's also so many characters. Nevada was a really fleshed out main character, and the dynamic with her family was also lovely to read as well. The magic of this world is really cool if you like elemental magic, and there's definitely a bit of steaminess already in book one that just made it a really fun and intriguing read. So like, this is definitely a very romance central urban fantasy series, but there's also so many series within the Alana Andrews world that I'm excited to check out as well. But the first one is Burn For Me in the Hidden Legacies, and if you haven't checked it out already, you definitely should. Next up, I have a YA series to recommend. I actually recently reread this series and loved it just as much as I remember loving it when I read it growing up, and that is the Graceling Realm series by Kristen Cashore. Oh my gosh, the emotional stakes, the romantic plot lines is gripping in every installment in this series. Each book is also different, following a different main character, and they will break you. Cool thing too is you honestly can read every book almost kind of like a standalone, especially the first two books. So I recommend reading them in order and enjoying the entire series because they're all so great. That being said, I would say my favorites are the first two, and I would also say the first two books have the best like romantic plot lines in combination with fantasy plot lines. I was broken, especially Fire. Oh my gosh. Fire is one of my all-time favorite YA fantasy books. The romance in this just absolutely broke me. So in the first book of the series, we're introduced to Katza, and she is a graceling. And in this fantasy world, a graceling is an individual who has an extreme skill, and this can really range from being like really good at baking bread to woodworking to flower arrangement, but Katza has a very specific skill, and that is killing people. Due to this, she's sort of forced to act as her uncle's enforcer, traveling the realm and basically putting political rivals in their place. And this is how Katza comes across a foreign prince named Poe. Stuck between the expectations of her evil uncle and kind of carving a new path for herself, Katza decides to help Poe, and everything sort of changes from there. Again, great and intriguing, very intense fantasy plotline. Also a beautifully written romantic pairing that I loved both as a child and again when I reread it. It was just absolutely captivating, truly obsessed. And the other book I would recommend, which you truly can read as a standalone completely, is Fire by Kristen Cashore. And I would also say of all the books in the Graceling realm, Fire is the one that I think has the most central romantic plotline, but this is a story that follows our main character Fire. And Fire is one of the last remaining human monsters, and her abilities as such kind of make her both equally loved and hated throughout the land. Her abilities have basically manifested in her being unbelievably beautiful, and when people, oftentimes humans, kind of lay eyes on her, they want to please her in any way, shape, or form, or capture and control her. Her entire life she's been kept in isolation in King Nash's land in a little home kind of set off to the side, and she's really only had interactions with a boy that she grew up with named Archer. But at the beginning of the story though, she's actually captured by a neighboring kingdom, and her entire world is kind of turned upside down when she begins to unpack kind of the political aspects of where she grew up, but also for the first time she's kind of interfacing with the world in a way that she never had before, creating and forming real lasting connections. A really intimate tale about a young woman kind of confronting a lot of the trauma she's faced throughout her entire life, and really like forging a path just for herself, surrounding herself with people who love her for who she is. And it's just a stunning book from beginning to end, and I loved it. Again, the romance in this is very, very central, and I fall in love with it every time I reread it. I've read this book so many times, and it just always delivers. It always makes me cry. It always makes me flip the pages, not put this book down. And it is also technically like enemies to lovers in a lot of ways, but it's done in such a beautiful way. It's like, it's not so simple, you know what I mean? This book, amazing. You gotta read it. You gotta check out the Graceling Realm series. It's so good and by far and away one of the best YA series out there. The last book I'm gonna recommend is The Beautiful Ones by Silvia Moreno-Garcia. This book is absolutely delightful and full of so much melodrama. I would say it's Jane Austen with a fantastical touch. Of all the books I've recommended today, I would say this book has like the least amount of magic. It's definitely more of like a literary fiction romance story with a dash of magic, but it all works and it's still really important to the plot line overall. And in this story, we follow our main character Nina, and she has just recently traveled from the countryside and is staying with her cousin and his wife. She's working to debut in society in hopes of securing a good match. Nina dreams of becoming a part of a socialite group called the Beautiful Ones, but Nina herself is kind of stumbling at the beginning of the season. First and foremost, because she's not from the city, a lot of people view her as uneducated or uninteresting or just unrefined. And also Nina herself has telekinetic abilities that she's always had trouble controlling, and it also seems to appear at the worst times, creating very, very uncomfortable and awkward situations for her. However, when entertainer Hector comes into her life at one of the parties that she's attending, she becomes incredibly inspired to harness her magic more, because Hector is a performer with telekinetic powers who travels all around the world showing off his magic. She quickly convinces him to become his apprentice so she can learn more, but Hector himself is hiding a very big secret, and that is he used to be in love with Nina's cousin's wife, and he's kind of using the relationship with Nina to get closer with her once again. This book is full of so much melodrama right out the gate, and this is very much a fantasy book that is strongly romance forward. This has all the delicious propriety that you would want in a story like this, from the dances to the walks to the calling cards and the whole thing. It has a dash of magic as our main character Nina is learning to control her telekinetic powers and kind of expand her knowledge with Hector. If you're interested in reading this book, you gotta come for the melodrama, because it is delicious and impossible to put down. The complicated situations that kind of set this book up really transform into still a very endearing romance story. Nina at the heart of it. I loved Nina. I was absolutely gripped by this book. I could not put it down. And again, if you love Jane Austen style stories, this is such a great book to pick up. It has so much great verbal sparring. It has so much like will they, won't they. It was amazing, and I loved this book so much. Such a great romance story with a dash of fantasy to check out. Alrighty guys, those are my fantasy books with romance recommendations. Please let me know down below some books you love that have this combination of genres, as I would love to know, because again, I'm a big fan. But I will see you guys soon with another video soon. Goodbye!